Okay, hello everyone. Alright, so the next program in chapter 5 is Paint Job Estimator. Alright, I have a little bit of code, so I'll sound a bit funny. Yes, alright. So a painting company has determined that for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint and 8 hours of labor will be required. The company charges $35 per hour for labor. Write a program that asks the user to enter the square feet of wall space to be painted and the price of the paint per gallon. The program should display the following data: the number of gallons of paint required, the hours of labor required, cost of the paint, labor charges, and then the total cost of the paint job. Alright, so we have been given some parameters over here, and we're going to work with it. Now, since chapter 5 is all about functions, we're going to be creating functions for each one of these tasks. Alright, and we're going to call them in. We're going to create a main method or a main function that we're going to call all other methods, all other functions in it. And so let's start. Let's start analyzing this. Alright, so a painting company has determined that for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint and 8 hours of labor will be required. Alright, so basically this is what we've done. We've read. Write a program that asks the user to enter the square feet of wall space to be painted. And the price of the paint per gallon. So we know that one of the first things we're supposed to do is write a program that is going to ask the user to enter the square feet of wall space. And then the other thing we need is to basically also ask for the price of the paint per gallon. So let's do that. Let's create a function for the function that's going to ask the user to enter the square feet of wall space. All right, so I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call it ask for wall space, or basically ask for ask for wall space. Right. Oops, let's see. Yeah, ask for wall space. Ask for wall space. Now it's not going to need. It's not going to need any. It's not going to need any parameters because so the user is not going to. It's not going to need any argument, so I'm not going to specify any parameter. That's what I'm trying to say. All right. When this function is called, all we wanted to do is ask the user for the wall space, right? So I'm going to go ahead and type the input function. The input function is, no semicolon. The input function is basically going to display a message to the user and allow the user to type in something back. So I am going to display this message to the user and say, please enter. So it says over here that ask the user to enter the square feet of wall space to be painted. So please enter the square feet square feet of wall space to be painted. Now, the input function by default always returns a string. So we are asking for the square feet of wall space, okay, in inches, right? I think. Sorry, in feet. It's right in front of my eye. All right, so in feet. But by default, the input function always returns a string. Even if the user types in a number, it returns it as a string, right? So we need to go ahead and convert this value to a float. Because now the square feet can be 112.8, 111.5, 2.5. So that's why we need to go ahead and convert it to a floating point number so that we can use it, right? Because by default, the input function always returns a string. So to do that, I'm going to basically call the float function and surround everything that the user has typed with parentheses. Basically, we are converting everything that the user has typed over here to a float. So the input function is going to display this message, allow the user to enter the square feet of wall space. Whatever the user types is going to be converted to a float, and once that happens, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to go ahead and define a variable. I'm going to call it user wall space. Right, and then once I'm done, let's break this line now. So this line over here is like a guide. I don't know if you can see it, but it's like a guideline to help me type in 80 characters on a line. Now 80 characters on a line, it's like a Python standard to type 80 characters on a line. So I'm trying to stick by that rule, okay, by using this line to guide me. So I know that I've exceeded 80 characters on a line, so I'm going to break this line into two. So I'm going to close it somewhere around here, close the string somewhere around here, concatenate it with the beginning of the string here. Now, before you break any line in Python you have to type in a backslash. So I'm going to break it here by typing in a backslash and hit enter. Okay, so I've broken this line into two here. All right. Now, once I have the user wall space, now I want to go ahead and return it. So return the user wall space, so that anytime that we call this ask for wall space, it's going to ask for the wall space, get the wall space, and then return it. Okay. So now we're done with that function. Now over here, it's also said that write a program that asks the user to enter the square feet of wall space to be painted and the price of the paint per gallon. Okay, so yesterday I had this Uber Eats free coupon code that basically so basically gives you like a your first meal on Uber Eats for free, and I told my brother about it and he was excited. He wants to also get free food with it. So that's what he texted me. I don't know why when I have this thing, I don't know how when I have this thing disabled or basically not launched, it still sends me messages. It's weird. It's weird. See, it says open now. Meanwhile, it's closed, but I'm getting messages anyway. It's not some kind of odd quirk in iMessage. I don't know. All right, that was just by the way. But anyway, all right. Yeah, if you have the Uber Eats, you can try it out for free. I think you can look for coupon codes online. Just Google free Uber Eats coupon code, but it's only for new users because yesterday was my first time using it. I just got an email from them. I said, okay, why not? So I got free food yesterday. So that was just by the way. All right, so ask for wall space is going to ask the user, get the wall space and return it. The next thing you're supposed to do over here it says okay, so ask for wall space and then the price of the paint per gallon. So let's go ahead and also ask for the price of the paint per gallon, right? So it's going to be something very similar to this, right? I'm going to copy this, create a function and call it ask for price of paint. Now you can create these as one function together, but then let's just separate things. So ask for price of paint, okay? What we are doing is we want to ask the user for the price of paint. So we're going to say, please enter the price of the paint, like this. Once we've asked the user this, the user is going to type in something that is going to be returned. We want that number formatted, formatted to a float. Okay, converted to a float because that user can type in 56.8. That's a floating point number, right? So we want it formatted to a float, and then we want once it's formatted to a float, we want it returned. And when it's returned, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called user, or basically price of paint. And then once we have the price of paint, we want to go ahead and return price of paint. So now we're done with the second function. So let's figure out what we have to do next. We have to calculate the number of gallons of paint required. So we have to use the parameters here to calculate the number of gallons of paint required. So let's create a function, okay, and call it calculate paint required. Paint required. This means calculate the number of gallons of paint required, right? But I'm just typing it. Calculate paint required. Now paint required is going to need some arguments, right? So but before that, let's analyze that. To know the number of paints required, now it's over here. The question said that a painting company has determined that for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint is required. 1 gallon of paint will be required. Okay, let's not even go here yet. Let's just work with a gallon of paint. So for every 112 square feet, 1 gallon of paint is required. So let's do the math here. I'm going to basically use a comment. This is ratio and proportion. I'm going to, normally when I see things like this, I like to use ratio and proportion to explain it, although some may already know it, but I like to do it so everyone is on the same page. So for every for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint is required, right? So if 112 square feet, square feet is equal to, let's say, 1 gallon of paint. One paint. Okay, 1 gallon of paint. Think about it, because for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint is required. If 112 square feet is equals to 1 gallon of paint, then the user square feet, which is the user wall space, the square feet that the user types, is going to be equal to what, right? Okay, so let's say user square feet or user wall space. You can think of it that way. User wall space. It's the same. It's in square feet, so is equal to what? That's the question we need. That's how we have to basically calculate it. That's basically how we have to calculate. My brother's still asking me that. Hold on. I would have to reply to him back. All right, so 112 square feet is equal to 1 gallon. Then the user square feet is equal to what, right? One second. All right. So the user is going to type in the wall space here. Okay, the user is going to type in the wall space here. So we're going to have it. We're going to know that value. So this is ratio and proportion. If 112 square feet is equal to 1, assuming the user wall space is, let's say, 12, right? Assuming it's 12. If it's 12, so basically, if 112 square feet is equals to 1, 12 is equals to what? If this 12 is less, then more divides. And what I mean by more divides is the bigger number of these two, the more number of these two is going to go under 12. It's going to divide. It's going to go under 12. And then you always end up multiplying by what's on the right, which is 1. Right? Assuming the user typed in, let's say, 1453 square feet, right? Then, so you're going to read it this way. If 112 square feet is equal to 1, then 10453 is equal to more, is going to be obviously equal to more, right? More gallons of paint. So if more, then less divides. And what I mean by less divides is the lesser number of these two, the less number of these two divides, meaning that number goes under 1453, and you always end up multiplying by 1. Okay, so this is how ratio and proportion works. If less, more divides. If more, less divides. Right? So when the number was less here, so because we know that 12 is going to give us less number of gallons, more divides. 12 divided by the bigger number, 112 times 1. When it was a bigger number, like let's say 1342 gives us more. We know it's going to give us more number of paints, but we don't know yet. But we know it's going to give us more number of paints based on these values. 112 gives us 1, then 1342 will give us more, right? And if more, less divides. Less divides means the lesser number of these two goes under 1342. You end up multiplying by 1. So you realize that in every case, you are dividing by 112 and multiplying by 1. When this number was 12, okay, 12 is going to give us less. So if less, more divides. 112 divided, so basically 12 divided by 112 times 1. We are always dividing by 112 and multiplying by 1. In the case where it was a bigger number, 1, 2, 3, 4 will give us more gallons of paint. And when it's more, less divides. The lesser number of these two, which is 112, divides. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 divided by 112 times 1. In every case, we're always dividing by 112 and multiplying by 1. So that's how to basically figure out the gallons of paint required, right? So this is just a way to, make everyone clear on that. So when you think about it, to calculate the gallons of paint, you're going to need the user square feet, because if I undo this, we need a user square feet over here. This is a user square feet. We need it. This is just an example, right? The user square feet is basically what the user is going to type in here. Okay, so we're going to need the user square feet the user's wall space as a parameter. Okay, so we have to define it. Okay, so it's going to need the user wall space. It's going to need a user wall space here. So to calculate the gallons of paint required, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called paint required, but not yet. Let's just work on the calculation here. Right, so we said that we were always dividing by 112 and multiplying by 1. Or it's basically divided by 112. So the user wall space, okay, divided by 112. I mean, you can go ahead and be very, very specific and multiply by 1, because we know that even if you don't multiply by 1, this is the same answer, right? But let's just be very, very specific. Doesn't matter, it's extra code, but hey, that's the calculation. So just in case you had this weird calculation that you had no idea how to solve it, you have to type in the full thing. So let's just type in the full thing, just although we don't have to, because every number multiplied by 1 is the same number, right? Let's just leave it here. So we realize that it's going to be the user wall space divided by 112 times 1 is going to give us the paint required. Once we have that, let's go ahead and return to, well, first of all, we know this is going to be the gallons of paint required, right? So let's store it in a variable called, let's say, paint required. Let's define a variable and call it, let's say, paint required. And once we have it, we can just go ahead and return it. Return paint required. Okay. So the next thing we have to figure out is the hours of labor required. Hours of labor required. So let's define a function called calculate hours of labor required here. Oops, thinking Java right now. All right. So hours of labor required. Okay, so let's also go through the question over here. It said for every 112 square feet of wall space, 1 gallon of paint. Okay, now forget about that, because we're not dealing with gallons of paint. It said for every 112 square feet, 1 gallon of paint and 8 hours of labor will be required. So that means that for every 112 square feet, 8 hours of labor will be required. For every 112 square feet, 8 hours of labor will be required. We are calculating the hours of labor required. Okay, so the same idea here. Okay, so if 112 square feet is equal to 8 hours. Okay, so if 112 square feet is equal to 8 hours, okay, then the user wall space user wall space is going to be equal to how many hours? That's how we are calculating the hours of labor required, because we've been told in the question that for every 112 square feet we are getting 8 hours of labor. So if 112 square feet gives us 8 hours, then whatever is typed as a square feet, as a wall space, is what? Right? Same idea for ratio and proportion. Assuming the user wall space is, let's say, 4 to 5, right? Same ratio and proportion method. If 112 square feet gives us 8 hours, then 45 obviously is going to give us less hours, right? 45 square feet is going to give us less hours, right? But 112 is bigger than 45, so for 45 we should get less. So, and remember ratio and proportion, if less, then more divides. More divides meaning the bigger number of these two, the more number of these two divides, meaning the bigger number goes under 45 and you end up multiplying by what's on the right, which is 8. So it's going to be 45 divided by 112 times 8. Now if this number was, let's say, 400, or let's say 345, it's a big number, right? So if 112 square feet gives us 8 hours, then 345 square feet is obviously going to give us more hours, because 345 is bigger than 112. So if, remember ratio and proportion is if more, less divides. If less, more divides. If more, less divides. Okay, that's it, right? Yeah. If less, more divides. If more, less divides. If less, more divides. If more, less divides. I hope I said that right. All right, so because 345 square feet is going to give us more hours, if more, less divides. So 112, the lesser number of these two is going to divide. And what I mean by divide is, the smaller number is going to go under 345, and you end up multiplying by what's on the right. So 345 divided by 112 times 8. Again, if this number was a small number, 3 square feet is going to give us less hours. And if less, more divides, the bigger number of these two, which is 112, it's going to go under 3. So it's going to be 3 divided by 112. And you end up always multiplying by what's on the right, which is 8 times 8. Now realize that, again, with this one, in every case, we're always dividing by 112 and multiplying by what's on the right, which is 8. We're always doing that. When this number was small, like 3, okay, so if 112 gives us 8, 3 is going to give us less. And if less, more divides. The bigger number of these two goes under 3 times 8, right? So it's going to be 3 divided by 112 times 8, right? The bigger number of these two goes under, the bigger number of these two goes under, for example, goes under 3, right? Because if less, more divides. 3 divided by 112 times 8. If we had a bigger number, let's say 2, 3, 4, we're also always dividing by 112 and multiplying by 8, and we can take that here too. If 112 gives us 8 hours, 2, 3, 4, 5 is going to give us more, right? And if more, less divides. The lesser number of these two divides, which is 112. It goes under the 2, 3, 4, 5, 2,345. And you end up multiplying by what's on the right. So it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 divided by 112 times 8. So we are always dividing by 112 and then multiplying by 8. All right, so basically, to calculate the hours of labor required, we are always dividing by 112 and multiplying by 8. So that's how to figure out the formula. I know some of you know this, but I like to always go over this just to make it clear to everyone. If you already know this, please feel free to go skip through it. If not, and it's helping you, I'm glad. All right, so we are always dividing by 112 and then multiplying by 8. That's how to calculate it. We will need as a parameter, as an argument, the user wall space, just like this one. We will need it, right? So I'm going to define a parameter called user wall space. And to calculate the hours of labor required, remember it was the user wall space divided by 112, and then we end up multiplying the result of that. So I'm surrounding it with parentheses to get the result of that first. We are multiplying the result of that by 8. This is going to give us the hours of labor required. So I'm going to create a variable called hours required here and store it here. And once we have the hours required, let's go ahead and return it. So return hours required. So now we're done. We're figuring out the paints required and the hours of labor required. The next thing we're going to figure out is the cost of the paint. The cost of the paint. Okay. So let's go ahead and define a function called calculate cost of paint. Right. Now, cost of paint, when you think about it, it said that the company charges. Okay, so we are not there yet. Remember over here it said that we're asking the user for the price of the paint here. Remember, we asked the user for the price of the paint. So if we have the price of the paint, then we have to multiply it basically by how many gallons of paint we need. So remember, we have a function that's calculating paints required. If we know the number of paints required, then we can go ahead and multiply it by the price that the user typed. The price of the paint here, ask for price of paint. The price that the user typed, we have to multiply the gallons of paint required by the price of the paint required to know the cost of the paint. Okay, so now the calculate cost of paint, first of all, is going to need, think about it, it's going to need the price of the paint. So I'm going to define parameters for those. And also it's going to need the gallons of paint required. So I'm just going to say paint gallons required, or just say gallons of paint required. So it's going to need the price of the paint, it's going to need the gallons of paint required. And basically, once it has those two values, whoever calls this function passes those two arguments, to calculate the cost of the paint, it's basically the gallons, this value here, gallons of paint required times the price of paint. And this calculation here is going to be the cost of the paint. So I'm going to define a variable called cost of paint, which is going to store that result. Okay. Once we have the cost of the paint, now let's go ahead and return it. Return cost of paint. This way. All right, so now we're done with the cost of the paint. Now let's calculate the labor charges, right? Labor charges. Now the question said the company charges $35 per hour for labor. Okay, very simple. Very it said the company charges $35 per hour for labor. Now, if we know the company charges $35 per hour, right? Now over here it said, remember we were calculating the hours of labor required. We were calculating the hours of labor required over here. So once we know the hours of labor required, by using this function to calculate it, all we have to do is multiply the hours of labor required times the $35 over here, which is given to us by the question. So to calculate, let's define a function called calculate labor charges. And labor charges, when you think about it, is going to need, first of all, the hours. Let's see. When you think about it, first of all, it's going to need the hours. Well, let's make this very flexible, okay? So just assuming that the price of this changes, let's make this very flexible. So that let's make it flexible. So let's pass in. Although we can go ahead and define this, call this $35 hard in the function. Let's make it as a parameter, right? Just to make this flexible, okay? So each time that value changes, let's see. One thing we can do is just define it in the function itself. We can do that. We can go ahead and define it in the function itself. So there are a couple of ways to do that. But if you can also make it flexible, where each time they have to type in the price. But you know, let's define it in the function itself. So calculate labor charges is just going to need the hours of labor required, which is going to be calculated with this function. So it's going to need the hours of labor required. So I'm going to define a parameter for that, hours of labor required. Right, and to calculate the hours of labor required, we have to multiply by the price per hour for labor, which is $35. So I'm going to kind of simulate a constant. It's just a regular variable. I'm going to simulate a constant by just defining it in uppercase, and I'm going to call it charge this way, charge per hour. That's like a good convention for naming constant or global variables, right? Constant. So charge per hour is going to be equal to 35. It's not really a true constant or true global variable, but it's just me naming it in capital letters gives me an impression that it's a constant value. It's just there's really no true global variable in Python. Okay, there's a global. You can define a variable as a global field, but you can't really. See, in Java we have like a final variable, which is a constant, real constant. In PHP you have, for example, you can define a constant, but in Python there's really not. But then, although there's a global type where you can define a variable as a global, where you can refer to a variable, or you can pull in a variable, okay, or you can bring a variable. How do I even say it? You can refer to a global variable using a global type. You can do that, but then just name it in capital letters makes me know that this is some kind of a function, although it's a variable. All right, I'm just simulating it. So this is a 35.00 charge. All right, so I'm just defining it. So when the price changes, we can come to this function and change it. So once I have the hours of labor required, all I'm doing is I'm multiplying the hours of labor required and then multiplied by the charge. Let's just go ahead and copy this. By the charge per hour. Okay, and hours of labor required times the charge per hour is going to give us, or basically is the labor charges, right? So I'm going to define a variable called labor charges. which is going to store the result of hours of labor required times, or basically, times the charge per hour. That's going to give us the labor charges. Once we have the labor charges, what we want to do is go ahead and return labor charges. And then that's our labor charges. And the last thing we need to do is the total cost of the paint job. Okay, so let's define a function that's going to calculate the total cost of paint job. It's a long name, but you can make it short if you want. All right, I like long names just to make it clear. All right, so the calculate total cost basically is, so when you think about it, the total cost is basically the total labor charge, or the labor charges, and then the cost of the paint. That's all. These were just to calculate a few some values, but the cost of the paint job is basically the cost of the paint and then the labor charges. That's all. So this calculate total cost of paint job is going to need the labor charges and then the cost of the paint. That's all. Because this was just calculating the hours of labor, this was calculating the paint required, this was asking for the price, and this was asking for the wall space. It's the total charges are going to be the cost of the paint plus the labor charges. And then once we have those two arguments passed into this function whenever it's called, we want to go ahead and add them together. So labor charges plus cost of paint. And this is going to basically give us our total charges, right? Or basically total cost. So I'm going to define a variable called total cost, which is going to store that. And then once I have that, what I want to do is just go ahead and return total cost. So we've created functions for all of these things here. And we're done. But the thing is we have to call them and then make it work in a real program, right? So I'm going to define a main function also. Now the main function is basically the function that is going to be called, is the first function that's going to be called when the program starts. And the main function is where we're going to call all these other functions. Okay. It's in almost every program, the main function is the first function that is called when the program starts. So we're going to call that function first and basically write our program in here. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is basically write a program to ask for the wall space and then apply the paint, right? So let's go ahead and call this function to ask for the wall space. So I'm going to go ahead and call this ask for wall space here. And we know that this function is going to return the user wall space. So when it's returning it, I need a place to store it. I'm going to define a variable and call it user wall space, which is going to be stored in here, right? Now it doesn't matter if this user wall space is the same as this user wall space. The scope of this variable is within the ask for wall space function. The scope of this user wall space is within the main function. So they don't see each other. Although they are spelled the same way, they look the same, they are not the same. Okay, these are considered two separate variables in two separate functions. Okay, they're considered two separate variables because they are in two different functions. So you can call them the same way. The same applies for all these. All right, so this is going to hold the user wall space because we know when we call this function, it's going to go ahead and return this. All right,